This is a fascinating conversation I have with Dr. Maurice Robinson on the Byzantine text. If you stick around to the end of the video, let us know by typing in the comments, digging deep. If you can't stay around that long, but you still appreciate this content, let me know by giving this video a like so I'll know to put out more content like this. And let's get right into the video now. Well, hello, friends. I'm happy to have Dr. Maurice Robinson on the YouTube channel again. I've got some questions for him today that I want to ask him in regards to the Byzantine text, but I just want to welcome you first, Dr. Robinson, and thank you for being on.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, for those of you who might not know, Dr. Robinson is an expert in textual criticism, and he has a particular focus on the Byzantine text. He takes a Byzantine priority approach, and we're going to be taking a look at some critiques that another scholar has made, Dr. Dirk Youngkind, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And he's made some critiques against the Byzantine text, I think, in a very charitable spirit, and we'll address those as well in a charitable spirit, but we're going to present a different perspective than what he does. And in his book, which is really an introduction to the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, he offers some critique against the Byzantine text that I want to ask Dr. Robinson about. So what I'm going to do, Dr. Robinson, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, and we'll address some of these questions. So one of the issues that Dr. Youngkind raises is, does later dominance prove originality? And I'm going to share a quote from Dr. Youngkind here. And he talks about the argument that's been put forward by yourself and other Byzantine advocates. He says, let's think about the argument first from the standpoint of transmission, namely that normal transmission would guarantee the dominant survival of the original text. Clearly, this is an a priori theoretical argument, and this argument will interpret and explain the evidence in a certain way. And taken on its own, it may even be right. But what is the evidence in favor of this assumption, besides the dominance of Byzantine text in later centuries? Admittedly, the manuscript evidence we have from the 4th century and earlier is limited, but none of the individual pieces of evidence suggest the existence of anything like text. Dr. Robinson, and I'll give you a chance to respond to Dr. Youngkind's critique here.
Okay, well, the critique that Dirk is writing is not unusual. It's the same critique that you have coming from others such as Metzger or Eldon Epp or Gordon Fee or others that favor the critical text. There's no surprise in this. But the argument on this issue of the dominance, as Dirk wrote it, that it was a theoretical assumption, is not an argument with my own position. It's an argument with what Westcott and Hort themselves said, and it was really Hort. He's the one that wrote their introduction. But Hort said very simply, and this is on page 45 of their introduction, as soon as the numbers of a minority exceed what can be explained by accidental coincidence, their agreement can only be explained on genealogical grounds. We have thereby passed beyond purely numerical relations, and the necessity of examining the genealogy of both minority and majority has become apparent. And then the key issue, a theoretical presumption indeed remains that a majority of extant documents is more likely to represent a majority of ancestral documents at each stage of transmission than vice versa. So if the argument is theoretical from Dirk Youngkind's perspective, then the argument is with Hort. It's not with my position. And I don't think that he wants to argue that much against Hort. He doesn't want to accept their theory in detail, but this is one of the foundation points that they start with, that there is that theoretical presumption, which then they spend the rest of the time in their introduction attempting to nullify. And the question is, if they could not successfully nullify that theoretical presumption, which modern scholars know they could not do because they reject the Westcott-Hort position and their theory, method, and genealogy approach, then everything kicks back to the original theoretical presumption. It doesn't just suddenly move into some new sphere where the presumption isn't present. So I would say, despite the fact that Dirk says this, the theoretical presumption still remains that normal transmission, this is Dirk's own words now, would guarantee the dominant survival of the original text. And as he said, this is an a priori theoretical argument, but also he said that this argument will interpret and explain the evidence in a certain way. And he at least favorably admits this argument may even be right.
Right. I noticed that.
I can say amen to that. So I think he's being much kinder in this approach than a lot of other critics are who want to just say there's no possibility. Mm-hmm. He's allowing the possibility here. So I'm all in favor of that aspect of what he's saying.
Yeah. So if I could kind of sum up kind of in a more of a maybe layman's terminology here. Basically what Hort has said, and correct me if I get this wrong, but basically what Hort has said is that when you come across this vast swath of manuscripts, when you have this incredible amount of dominance, the presumption would be that this goes back to the original text, unless you have really good, compelling arguments against that, basically defeaters of that a priori position. Then you need to assume that this dominance is there because it goes back to the original. And what you're saying is that's what Hort tried to establish, but even modern textual critics say Hort failed.
Well, what happened was Hort's way of getting rid of this dominance was that he would say the Byzantine text had to have been created by a formal recension revision process that took place in the 4th century. If that formal revision did not take place, then he had no way otherwise to explain the rise and dominance of the Byzantine text, and everything then would have to shift back to the theoretical presumption. So the theoretical presumption is there, but it also fits in with what normal textual transmission, apart from any formal recension, would theoretically result in. And that's all that my position has been. And it's not just me, but my co-editor, Pierpont, the same position, that we're saying if there was no formal recension in the 4th century creating the Byzantine text, everything reverts back to Hort's original theoretical presumption.
Yep. Oh, that makes sense. So one of Dirk's other points here is that there isn't. So while you'll find individual readings sometimes in the earlier manuscripts from the Byzantine text as a continuous text form, maybe that's the way to say it, you don't find it before the 4th century. And how would you respond to that?
Well, it's guaranteed that there is no single manuscript before the 4th century that has a thoroughly Byzantine text. They just don't exist. Why is that? Well, manuscripts before the 4th century are going to have been written on papyri. Those papyri, except in areas that have the exceedingly dry climate like Egypt, are not going to survive. They will end up getting worn by use. They'll get damaged by dampness, and they just don't survive except in a dry climate. So it is no surprise that the papyri we have primarily came from Egypt. Some may be from what would be in the southern Palestinian area, but these papyri coming from this region probably would be expected to reflect an Egyptian regional text. And I have no problem with that. I expect them to do so. It doesn't mean that the Egyptian manuscripts are so radically different from the Byzantine that you can't recognize one from the other. In contrast, as I've pointed out many times, 94% of the text between, say, the critical text of the Nesalalan text and the Byzantine text, 94% is identical with no variation. And even if you go to the papyri that have their own scribal blunders, errors, and everything else, they still have an exceedingly high degree of agreement with the ultimate Byzantine text form. So I have no problem with seeing most of the text being preserved in even the papyri, except that it's just not going to be any papyrus being thoroughly Byzantine under those circumstances. But if we had papyri from the primary Greek-speaking region, which would be anything from basically around the Jerusalem area going northward up through Syria into Asia Minor and then even to southern Italy, that's the primary Greek-speaking area. That area includes where most of the New Testament documents either were written or where they were sent to. And the documents from those regions, by and large, not all of them, but by and large, they reproduce a Byzantine form of the text. So I'm not surprised that if you get down to Egypt, you may have a localized Egyptian form of the text that may have some relation or connection with the Coptic translation of the Byzantine text with, say, Alexandrian text critical know-how having been applied to the text to prepare it for the Coptic version. So to have Greek manuscripts primarily from that region that may have some Coptic leanings is no surprise in any case. And that would even include going up to the earliest vellum manuscripts that we have, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, that do reflect a text that is far closer to the Egyptian Coptic version than it is to either the Byzantine or the Latin type, Western type text. So there is, wherever Sinaiticus and Vaticanus were copied, there is still a tie-in and connection that is much closer to the Coptic version than anything else, which tends to give you some Egyptian source for that, as opposed to what you might have expected coming from the primary Greek-speaking region where papyri just simply didn't survive after the 4th century.
Yeah, yeah. So it seems like to me, I heard James Snap Jr. once say that favoring the manuscripts that have these Alexandrian readings is kind of like favoring the manuscripts that have the best weather, and I thought that was pretty funny.
It might be actually astutely correct, because the best weather is the dry weather that preserve those manuscripts.
Right, right. So another question I was going to ask you in regards to this. So with the rise of a newer generation of critical text proponents, I'm thinking of people like people that you know and are friendly with, Peter Gurry and some of the younger guys that are coming on the scene now. How do they typically? And I'm not asking you to speak specifically to Peter Gurry, but in a general sense, how do critical text proponents explain the rise and preeminence of the Byzantine text?
The current view, which really goes back to Caldwell and later was followed by the Allens, and that was the process view, that over time you would have slight changes, some accretions made, additions to the text. Some things may have been paraphrased. They may have had changes in word order, substitution of easier words for more difficult, and that the process would slowly, step by step move a text from, assuming the Alexandrian were original, from the Alexandrian text, it would slowly, step by step, move inexorably, is the word that someone used, toward what becomes the Byzantine text by the 4th century. So basically, within 300 years or 200 and something years, that this process on its own, without controls being imposed, that would be like a recension that Westcott Hort had suggested, that somehow in these 250 years, the process would just suddenly move to a Byzantine form of the text, which after that point barely changed at all for the next 1,000 years. Why would the process not have continued and the text of, say, 1200 AD not at all look like the text of, say, 4 or 5 or 600 AD, when it actually looks more like the 1200 AD than it does the ones previous to the 4th century. So this is part of the problem.
Yeah, no, that's very, very interesting. So I think we've covered quite a bit of ground in this first video. I've got some more objections from Dr. Dirk Youngkind. I'm hesitating because I might be mispronouncing his last name. I apologize if you watch this, Dr. Youngkind. I'm mispronouncing your name, but we'll probably save those for another segment. And Dr. Robinson, I really appreciate you coming on. Appreciate your time, and look forward to talking to you again.
Okay, glad to do it.